Good afternoon, everybody. And afternoon or evening or morning, in whenever time zone you are. Rajeev Bhargava, who is in Delhi, it's 10 o'clock at night there. Welcome, Rajeev. Welcome, everybody. My name is José Casanova, and I am an emeritus professor of sociology and theology at Georgetown University and a senior fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, which is sponsoring this series, along with Reset Duck. This event is being video recorded and will be available to everybody on YouTube probably at the beginning of next week. We'll follow the usual structure. We'll have first a conversation for about 55 minutes, and then we'll open up the session for a question and answer from the audience. There is a question and answer box down there at the bottom of your screen. Please do write your questions, and we will try to transmit them to Rajeev Bhargava, who will be able to answer as many as possible. So again, welcome everybody, and especially welcome to Rajeev Bhargava, who is a distinguished Indian political theorist, also a very close friend and esteemed colleague. He is now the director of the Institute for Indian Thought at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, of which he was for many, many years the director. He's a world-renowned scholar, has visiting appointments in universities throughout Europe and the United States, and he is the foremost theorist on Indian secularism. Indeed, the title of our conversation today is Indian and Western Varieties of Secularism. So Rajeev, welcome very much. Welcome.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor. And so good to see you.
Okay, very good to see you. Hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll be able to get together again. Very good. Now, in 1998, you edited a volume, Secularism and its Critics in India, basically discussing the different debates on Indian secularism. This was a time before any of those debates had really emerged in the West. So it was the first time that these debates emerged. But then about 10, 20 years later, similar debates raged through France, the US, Turkey, Indonesia, and throughout the Muslim world. So let's first discuss this volume to explain the context to an audience. Why now? Which were the kind of critics? And what was your defense? You became from this moment on the spirited defender of Indian secularism. So let's put all this debate, the Indian debate, in context first, please.
Well, thanks. Thanks for the question. There were three objectives of that volume that I edited. First, to make us Indians realize that the current debate in India had a history. So I included intellectuals and scholars who wrote about it in the early 60s and tried to generate an interconnected historical narrative of Indian secularism after independence from colonial rule. Second, as you have pointed out, the discussion of secularism in the West was at that time scarce, and with one or two exceptions, not very theoretical. I wanted Western academia to take notice of this extremely rich Indian debate, just as I wanted Indian intellectuals to stop depending on text-based stereotypes and formulaic conceptions of Western secularism. I felt that Indian intellectuals needed to understand that in reality, secular states function very differently in different Western countries. So I tried to do this by including in the volume the French and the American case. And I very much wanted to include Nilofer Gole's paper on challenges to Turkish state secularism in the volume, but unfortunately, the final version reached me after I sent the manuscript to the publishers. And by the way, I believe that the first ever panel in recent times on secularism was held in Hawaii by the Center for Transcultural Studies in 1994, the same year when, José, you published your very influential and famous book on public religions in a modern world. And that panel included Charles Taylor, Nilofer, and myself. So I believe that all these different versions of secularism had not been placed alongside each other. And to my knowledge, at least, no proper comparison was made before the volume was published. And finally, in political theory, few scholars, if any, had made secularism an object of theoretical inquiry. And I believe that happened when the Oxford Handbook on Political Theory was published as late as 2006. Political secularism, a term that I've used to distinguish state-oriented secularism from secular humanism and ethical secularism, was introduced as a topic in that handbook, probably for the first time in political theory. And I must have been invited to do so because of secularism and its critics. So I'm glad that volume received the attention that it did. To answer the second part of your question, already in Secularism and its Critics, I'd written somewhat sketchily about Indian secularism and how it was different from other models, the French, the American, the Turkish. And as I read more about these different secularisms, I became more and more convinced about its distinctiveness. However, the main reason I shifted my academic focus to secularism away from my early interest in extremely abstract theoretical issues in the philosophy of social science, my interest had been in methodological individualism, had directly to do with political developments in India. In 1989, with the growth of a militant Hindu nationalism that had turned the building of a temple for Lord Ram on exactly the same site where once a masjid functioned, the Hindu nationalists had made that a central project. And with it, the attacks on political secularism had intensified. A little earlier, and with no connection whatsoever with Hindu nationalism, academics such as Ashish Nandi and T.N. Madan opposed secularism as a normative ideal in India, but did not fully realize that their critiques really focused on a very Western, French, or American idea held uncritically by some left intellectuals. I was compelled to respond to these political attacks and academic critiques, but I also found that Indian proponents of secularism had no explicit defense to offer. The left in particular had not taken conceptual analysis or normative theory seriously and had sought only social scientific explanations of the crisis of capitalism and the limitations of the politics that surrounded it. Western political theory, on the other hand, and in particular liberalism, had developed a whole normative vocabulary focusing on values of freedom, equality, justice, and fraternity. But then it had very little currency in India. Nobody really bothered about all this. And besides, barring one or two exceptions, such as Taylor, they had not deployed this normative theory to issues of religion and state. Taylor's first piece on this was published in Secularism and Critics. So it's all this which led me not only to offer a proper normative defense of secularism, but to slowly become what you call a spirited defender of Indian secularism.
Right, and you've continued doing this for for since then. Let's now try to figure out what it is your argument that makes Indian secularism unique. Basically, all forms of secularism are grounded on some kind of dual principle that Al Stepan called the twin tolerations. In the case of the United States, is the dual clause of no establishment and free exercise. Now, your argument is that Indian secularism is based on the dual principle of principal distance, which will be the equivalent or the parallel to basically establishment, and critical respect, that will be a different principle than free exercise. So tell us in which way these dual principles are different from the dual clause, the American model, or from French laïcité, for instance. And then we'll continue.
Let me begin by talking about critical respect. And here I think religion can be usefully conceived, at least for my purposes, as comprising two major sort of subdomains. First, every religion should be seen as one among many ethics of self-realization and self-perfection, and also as something that delineates a path for such realization. Now, though often an individual pursuit, it needs someone to look up to, a teacher or a set of teachers. And it also needs co-participants and fellow travelers on this path to give mutual support and to reinforce each other's commitments. So religion, for me, is a group activity and presupposes an ethical community. And all these dimensions of there being an ethical community in which individuals come together and pursue their path to self-realization, this is a very big positive dimension in religion, or for that matter, in non-religious philosophies. And I think that this ethic, such an ethic of self-perfection and self-realization, can be God-dependent, gods and goddesses dependent, or entirely independent of God. And this pluralism is extremely important, and it's always been important in India. But religion also has another dimension. It consists of and prescribes norms of social interaction, very often who to marry and whom not to, what to eat and what not to, who to eat with and who not to, which types of work are socially more significant than other jobs, and therefore who should perform which job in whose service, and so on. Now, these social relations are very often enmeshed in power and hierarchy. They involve domination, oppression, exclusion, marginalization, and so on. So all these religions have also got these oppressive relations within themselves. And many of them also tell you what you may or may not do in relation to people who are outside your community. And in some extreme cases, a distinction is drawn between, say, true and false God, and an imperative is constructed that those who worship false gods are enemies to be fought. And with this, you have the emergence of a new form of hatred, a new form of violence, a new kind of intolerance, which is directed not only against others, but also against people within the community who are believed to have gone astray, who are tempted by false gods, or forsaken the true doctrine, and so on. So in my view, all religions are deeply morally ambivalent. Some of their aspects must be deeply valued, they're indispensable, and others need to be criticized. And that's what I've tried to capture in the use of the term critical respect. And the further idea here is that if you love or adore or respect something, you would be more sensitive to the flaws of that thing, the flaws that the thing is acquired or that person is acquired. And to identify these flaws, you need both an insider's understanding as well as the ability to stand outside it. And this can be done only when you have that sense of discernment, for which one may use the word reason or critique. So since religion has got something in it that is valuable and something that one cannot really value, one simply has to adopt this very nuanced and sophisticated relation of critical respect. Now, how does it relate to principal distance? How do you translate this stance, this attitude, into public policy of a democratic state? For this, I believe the state needs to adopt a policy of principal distance. In short, an ability to engage with or disengage from religion, to engage positively with religion, that is to say, help and facilitate the pursuit of its ethics, to give support to ethical communities, but also to engage negatively with it, which means to discourage, to disapprove, and to hinder those practices within religion that harm the practitioners of believers, that harm individuals, harm other members of the same religious community, what I call intra-religious domination, as well as harm members of other communities, which I call inter-religious domination. So to take an example from India, while schools that are run by religious community are often funded by the state on the ground that there's just something valuable, and within the limits imposed by the constitutional principles of freedom, equality, and fraternity, untouchability is constitutionally banned. Temples from which former untouchables were excluded have been thrown open to everybody. Religious customs and norms which are encoded in civil codes are challenged by people with the help of the state in order to make them more gender just. So the state sometimes has to leave religion alone, respect religious freedom, and sometimes it has to engage with it to help or hinder it. Now, if this is the case, then the state cannot do what an idealized American model, or at least one interpretation of that model, which talks about strict separation, wall of separation, or what I call the mutual exclusion model associated with the United States. If it follows, this model doesn't quite fit into the American version, but nor does it fit the French version, which is again, I'm idealizing it, which sort of propagates one-sided exclusion, where ostensibly the state can interfere with religion, but religion cannot interfere in the affairs of the state. So the state controls religion. It discourages public presence of any religion if it doesn't entirely bar it, and so on. And this is also, this model of principal distance is also different from all European models because this stance of critical respect and policy of principal distance is not meant only for the dominant religion or for the dominant church, but for all religions. Potentially every religion can benefit from the state, or it can be interfered with, depending upon which of these helps intra and inter-religious domination. So that is, in sum, my understanding of constitutional Indian secularism, and why and how this secularism is so very different from other models of secularism that are found in Europe or in the North Atlantic.
Right. If one looks at all these historical contexts, continental Europe, France, the United States, India, it's very clear that secularism has not emerged out of the head of theories that then try to apply to the world, but has emerged as a pragmatic response to challenges of how to establish democratic societies, how to protect the principles of both liberty and equality and solidarity, fraternity, whatever you want to call it, in very different contexts. In some contexts, there was, again, a dominant church, and the task was how to precisely curtail this dominance to allow freedom of religion for others and non-believers. In the case of India, was very clearly a different context of religious pluralism, but very different from the United States. So what it seems clear is that secularism has not to be understood as a political theory, universal general political theory, which should apply to all places, but really the task is a pragmatic one of trying to find how to improve each particular democratic constitutional context. So in this respect, how can one form of secularism help teach something, help each other? How can we, in which way can we learn something from Indian secularism if each of these contexts is so different?
Oh, well, first of all, I must say that I completely agree with the way you've articulated this issue, that there isn't a perfect model, that secularism really emerged not as a doctrine in most places, but in a more in a pragmatic context in response to various forms of domination. So I think, with the possible exception of France and Turkey and much later India, in a somewhat confused way, you're absolutely right. Political secularism has not developed as a doctrine. So each secularism, I believe, has not only developed in its own specific context, and to a large extent is valid within that context, but has its own, as I mentioned, its own distinctive features, and this must be recognized. And I've actually used the term contextual secularism for exactly this reason. However, as you pointed out, there is great scope for improvement and mutual learning, and that's a job that must be done imaginatively and without any nationalist prejudice. So I entirely agree that on this point too. Now, I recommend the principal distance model that was developed in India, not because I think it is the best model or that it should be seen as a blueprint by others, but because I believe that other models of secularism, particularly in the West, developed in predominantly single religion societies. And their main focus was, after a great deal of religious homogenization had taken place, and there was a very strong alliance between one dominant church and the state, in the confessional states. After that, a struggle began between the church and the state, and the secular idea was to separate church and state for various reasons. Many of them had to do with power, but also to some extent for some values, particularly values which were construed more individualistically. So individual liberty and equality between individuals, and of course, in the French case, citizenship equality, but citizens were also construed as entirely independent of religious communities, and they were not their identities were not mediated by religion. So I think that that has significantly changed in the Western countries. The West is no longer what it was in the early 20th century because of colonization and the coming of immigrants from the formerly colonized countries into different parts of Europe. And because of the intensification of globalization, I think there is now much greater religious diversity, the like of which Europe is not seen in at least the modern era. And because of that, because of this turn to being a more religiously diverse society, the model that was developed in India, which is taken different multiple religions as a natural part of the cultural landscape, I think that model, therefore, can have something to, well, teach is a big word, but something to offer to many Western conceptions. I believe that very early on, Indian secularism got its impetus from European ideas of religion-state separation, and so a lot of the focus on intra-religious domination probably was mediated by what people had learned from Europe in India, but it's also true that Indian secularism was always sensitive to religious pluralism, and this is a point that everybody recognizes. And I think this is, given the changed circumstances, I think Indian secularism can now also offer something to Europe. So there has to be, this is the way in which I think there can be some give and take, mutual borrowing. And it's in that spirit that I've recommended principal distance, and polemically argued that if you judge by the standards of the Indian model of political secularism, by the yardstick of principal distance, many European states are found wanting, and have polemically said that they're not secular enough. But that's only that's something that I say with tongue in cheek, because very often you'd recognize that. I mean, Indians have been told that we are not modern enough, and so on. So I think it's in that cheeky spirit that I sometimes tease my European friends that they're not secular.
So I take the tease positively, and actually I'm persuaded. I've been always persuaded by your spirit of defense, but you've also been a critical public intellectual of democratic politics in India, and you have also have recognized the difficulties, the problems, the challenges that's particularly a Hindu or majoritarian Hindu nationalism presents to this model. I mean, if we look at the context of emergence of Indian secularism, was precisely as a response after the tragedy and the trauma of partition, the need to create a political system where Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs and Buddhists and Christians and Parsis and so on all could live together within this nation. And especially the problem of a very, very large minority of Muslims that remain in India even after the partition, and that indeed there's many Muslims today in India as either in Pakistan or in Bangladesh. So it is, after Indonesia, the largest number of Muslims in any country in the world. So what are then the challenges which majoritarian Hindu nationalism presents to this model of principal distance and critical respect? What is the problem then?
Right.
What are the challenges?
So I would actually like to answer this question by laying out very, very sketchily the historical evolution of the larger context in India, because something has been happening for a very, very long time in India. And I'd like to draw your attention to that. And I'd like to do it in the following manner. So while in Europe and in even the United States, a process of what I would like to call de-religionization has been going on for quite some time. You might call it secularization. But in India, which did not have religion in the European sense until recently, say 200, 300 years or so, has been moving in the reverse direction. That is, it is religionizing itself. Now, what do I mean by these terms? In Western Europe, I believe, and this is what I mean by de-religionization, Christian beliefs are no longer the dominant beliefs in many Western European societies. but are one set among many options. One might say that in Europe, we witness the birth and growth of multiple ethics of self-realization. Pluralization is an integral part of this process of de-religionization, or what Charles Taylor has called a secular age. Now, likewise, the connection that once existed between Christian ethics on the one hand, the Christian sort of mode of salvation, and Christian social norms, that tight connection has been loosening. And this too is a blow to religion in the sense in which I understand it, which I take to be a comprehensive system, which puts together this ethic and the social norms in a very tight connection, so that they become more or less inseparable. But I think that's been sort of blown apart in more recent times for a large number of people in Europe and North America, and likewise the connection that existed between church and state has been that connection has been loosening, and there's been a separation of church and state to various degrees in different parts of Europe. So I see Europe and America as having gone through this process, but in India, in the subcontinent, we are moving in exactly the opposite direction. That doesn't mean that we have eclipsed the kind of cultural context or the social imaginary that existed before our contact with Europe, but certainly things have changed quite radically in the opposite direction, and that is to say, in the direction of religionization. So many Indians are obsessed with creating one unified Hindu ethic, albeit pretty minimally, and this despite the presence of multiple gods and goddesses. Second, to some extent, we wish to forge a stronger link between this system of Hindu ethics with a specific set of social norms, particularly caste-related norms, many of which continue to be hierarchical. So some Hindus have this vision of a unified Hinduism that would make it like what Christianity was, or in some places still is, and what Islam in many countries currently happens to be. And third, there is an attempt to forge a stronger alliance between this unified Hinduism and the state. The most distinguished leaders of the anti-colonial struggle and the majority of those who drafted the Indian Constitution pushed for something very different, for a mix of traditional religious pluralism, which was inspired by Gandhi, and an egalitarian, freedom-sensitive social ethic. So they resisted what I call religionization. They also pushed for a secular state, keeping the ends of the state separate from the ends of all religions. But for a long time, there have been political agents and movements which are trying to undo this. And currently, the political mood in our country, created by the party in power, is against that founding vision. The majoritarian Hindu Nationalist Party is spearheading this push and constitutes a major threat to the Indian Constitution and to Indian secularism. And in this, they were certainly helped by the gradual abandonment of constitutional secularism by all political parties, who replaced it by what I've called party political secularism. Party political secularism is a perverted form of Gandhian secularism that allows the state to play footsie with and support, for purely opportunistic reasons, the loudest, the most dogmatic, and the most politicized fringe of every religious community. In this party political secularism, the word critical is removed from respect, and respect is reduced to cutting political deals with the self-styled spokespersons or leaders of every religious community. Now, once this was done, the Hindu Nationalist Party came into the picture, and it could attack the opportunism of all parties, all to serve its own interests to grab power. And it attacked opportunistic distance by not only attacking the opportunism of other political parties, but by dissolving the very idea of the state keeping distance from the dominant religion. So here, in a peculiar way, you not only get rid of principal distance, but also opportunistic distance by getting rid of distance altogether. And this is a further blow to Indian secularism, because now you have people have begun to imagine all kinds of connections of the majority Hindu religion with the Indian state. Third, should I stop here or?
No, please.
Okay, and third, this nationalist party, Hindu Nationalist Party, has interpreted the democratic idea of rule by an elected temporary majority to mean permanent rule of an ethnic majority. And they've managed to convince many Hindus that democracy really means ruled by Hindu majority. And therefore, Hindu interests must override the interests of others at any cost. And this too severely damages Indian secularism. So, there are all sorts of ways in which this Hindu nationalism has undermined secularism, and sometimes the very conditions, the very preconditions of the working of a principal distance and of a secular state.
Now, to a certain extent, we know that any form of majoritarianism, I mean, what Tocqueville called the tyranny of the majority, of course, is a fundamental problem of all democracies. And to a certain extent, we see throughout the world emerging crisis of secularism, along with a very serious crisis of democracy everywhere. We could begin a conversation about similarities and differences between how these very same issues you've mentioned in the case of India are emerging also similarly in the US. Here it is fought through the courts, but we see how much the courts themselves become part of these political struggles and cannot really develop the kind of principled distance vis-a-vis both the majority or political parties and also religious mobilizers. So let's talk about why do you think that we are everywhere? Because we see this crisis emerging throughout Europe. We see this crisis emerging in Turkey, in Russia, in different ways. But everywhere you see different elements of a resurging religious populist nationalism. Even we didn't think that we could talk of a re-emerging Christian nationalism in the United States, but we see it emerging. So how can we explain this global phenomenon, and how can we do precisely to somehow further the principles both of democracy and a secular democracy that can precisely somehow maintain the promise of these constitutional arrangements that seem to work for a while, but now appear to be in crisis in many places?
Well, I mean, there is, of course, you're right. I mean, there are global factors at play in the crisis of democracy virtually everywhere, and in the crisis of secularism. But each country has its own specific causes for the crisis of both democracy and secularism, and these are also related to one another. So let me see if I can give a kind of a general answer, and then also try to give the more specific answer pertaining to the crisis in India. So I think, I mean, I'm sure all of us would agree with this, that neoliberal globalization has been and always was going to be a double-edged sword. It both lifted millions of Indians above the poverty line. I mean, that is something that we have to acknowledge. but it's also created a new super rich elite and a new group of people who are either genuinely deprived or feel genuinely deprived. Now, the new wave of aspiration for material well-being and equality that has been unleashed by this whole globalization also creates a constant need to compare one's own condition with the condition of others, especially with those who are marginally better than oneself. And this plays massively on a very basic human emotion. I mean, you mentioned Tocqueville, and I recall that Tocqueville talked about how one of the main emotions in democracy, by which, of course, he meant social democracy, was envy. And this is something which is very rampant in many parts of the world, I'm pretty sure, and certainly in India. Everybody now has a sense of relative deprivation and therefore can build a narrative of victimhood around themselves. And this was always going to create a permanent sense of crisis, of anxiety and impatience. And, you know, neoliberal globalization also created a new, newly rich middle class. And central to its culture is this, are these emotions of envy and these feelings of victimhood. This is a kind of a permanent mindset of a large number of people who have only recently sort of become rich. I mean, this was going to be an ideal setting for what might call, you know, a kind of a mini counter-revolution against the original constitutional vision of that was set out by our founders. There has been an attack on socialism, on the idea of social justice. There has been a demand to roll back and try or an attempt to undo in a very indirect and oblique way any positive action, affirmative action for Dalits and for the scheduled tribes. And this was certainly fueled by a new reservation policy for what we call the other backward castes that was introduced in 1990 by the implementation of the Mandal Commission. And along with this idea of withdrawal of benefits for the poor and the Dalits came an attack on separate rights for minorities, which was widely propagated as you know, special privileges, when in fact that was a way of minorities to get or to procure something which are routinely procured by the majority. So it wasn't really a special privilege, but it was certainly a different right. And so you know, a lot of people, based on some of the things that I mentioned, that new culture, feel that enough of concession has been given, enough of sacrifice has been made by the rich, by the upper caste and by the religious majority, and it's time to now stop all that. And so, in fact, this sort of counter-revolution has also begun to target the new freedoms that are made available to women. So there's all kind of, you know, crisis in programs of social justice, affirmative action, and secularism, all of which are linked really to the development of the crisis of Indian democracy. But, you know, there are global causes at play here. Neoliberalism itself is a global phenomena. But I think the fall of the Soviet Empire always had the potential to have one global, a very negative outcome, which is, it didn't have to happen, but I mean, it was always there as a possibility. And in fact, I think that possibility has been realized, a new form of barbaric, unbridled capitalism. And with it, the creation of massive economic inequalities. But also, you know, one can't ignore, even before the fall of the Soviet Empire, major developments that took place in that fateful year of 1979, which saw the birth of a new militant political Islam in Saudi Arabia, the the Islamic Revolution in Iran and a change in the political climate of Pakistan and Afghanistan. So when 9/11 happened, it was easy to give a massive religious gloss to all these global events. It not only strengthened militant Islamic movements, but exclusivist religious nationalisms everywhere. It launched new imperial adventures, such as the intervention in Iraq, which was bound to have an impact both on democracy and secularism. The crisis of democracy, you can see a symptom of that in new methods of surveillance and the curtailment of individual rights that was brought as a result of 9/11 and the successive wars. The space for the liberal part in the hyphenated liberal democracy seems to have shrunk everywhere. Democracy is more and more reduced to electoral democracy. And as I mentioned already, I mean, there are new militant forms of religious nationalism that have grown in response to this militant global Islam. So all these, and of course, again, this is something which is not a new point at all. I mean, there has been, in the last 10, 15 years, there has been a rise of authoritarian populisms that have magically brought together the big losers and the big winners of neoliberalism together on the same political platform against traditional elites, against the traditional middle classes and the vision that they propounded. And this has happened in India as well. In fact, those traditional elites and the traditional middle classes have jumped to this new ideological bandwagon. The social media is no longer, as it was once believed, a reasonable space for discussion and debate, but it's become an arena of hate speech perpetuated by an army of paid trolls. So all this, I mean, for me, I must confess, it's very hard to think of a proper response to these large, overwhelming global developments. I mean, how do we rescue social media from barbaric forms of global capital and their instrumental use by people who have money and power? I don't know. And I'm afraid my tendency is to retreat to the pre-1991 world of left liberals, thinking of how we can preserve the status quo, how we can conserve the values of the Indian constitutions, how we can bring back social justice on the agenda of popular and peaceful political struggles. These are all, I'm afraid, these may not suffice. This is a new world which needs new responses. And I simply don't have the imagination to contribute to that vision. I don't fully understand it. So while I can see a whole lot of problems, when you ask me, if I can think of a response, I just give up. I mean, I'm really befuddled and bewildered by all that is happening around me, and I need your help. And we must meet more often.
Well,
all of us.
I mean, to all this, I mean, let's add something more to all this pandemonium. Let's add the pandemic.
Yeah.
How does the pandemic in any way perhaps affects those developments, perhaps at least makes bare, I mean, reveals precisely all these cleavages and all these problems. So what do you think, how is the COVID pandemic affecting Indian society, Indian politics, Indian secularism?
Well, I mean, the impact on democracy is pretty well known. I mean, it's the same everywhere. Surveillance is intensified. The government has access to all our personal data, our health data, and we are ourselves complicit in this because of our addiction to social media. And COVID-19 has only intensified this trend. But more importantly, I think the lockdown and the continuing kind of residue of lockdowns has closed all open public spaces. While the markets have opened up, the political spaces have not. And And this severely restricts the possibility of public protest. Although people have defied governments here and there, but it's hard to deny that public protest has become extremely difficult. And sustained social movements that can put pressure on the government are virtually impossible. And our dependence on social media has increased because we can't meet people, we can't assemble peaceably, and this has led to the intrusion of the state into our private lives, and it's really impacted our political lives. So, and this is something which we all share, I'm sure. I mean, but I think along with the crisis of democracy, our secularism also faces new challenges. Minorities have been further stigmatized in this period, ostensibly for being careless and being filthy and unobservant of public norms of safety and health. So very early on in March, there was a public gathering of an international Muslim organization. I think it was Tablighi Jamaat, which was granted permission by the government, but
which is probably the largest gathering of international gathering of Muslims all over the world. I mean, other than the Hajj.
Yes, probably, but I think we had it in Delhi. It was to be held in Bombay. In Bombay, it didn't take place, but in Delhi it did. I mean, it was in one. I can't remember the term for that, but it was in one sort of a public space which was enclosed. It was very unfortunate, and it was quite. I mean, I don't think permission should have been granted, but nonetheless, once that permission was granted, then the meeting took place, and after that, you know, Muslims were treated as COVID-19 affected suspects. Many of those people who took part in that gathering were quarantined for an indefinite period. Some were even put in jail, while, you know, probably not at the same time, but a little later, there were very similar gatherings of Hindus, which were completely overlooked and ignored. And likewise, the most elementary principle of a capitalist market, you know, the buying and selling of goods and services without discrimination, that began to be violated. I mean, I hope it's not happening now, but at that time, in April, I think it was really quite tragic and very upsetting, because one Muslim fruit seller was shown in a video to be putting his saliva on a fruit in order to give it to a fresher look. And from then on, virtually every Muslim in parts of North India who had anything to do with the sale of food items was viewed with great suspicion and was considered an outcast, someone from whom one could not buy anything. I know of people who refused to buy bread from bakers, from bakeries that were run by Muslims. It was, and all kinds of narratives against Muslims, which are already doing the rounds, you know. They're out to convert, they're lustful predators who wish to cast a spell on Hindu women and marry them with the sole purpose of converting them to Islam. They're an existential threat to the Hindu way of life. All these narratives were intensified, at least in the early period of COVID-19. So yes, I mean, quite certainly both Indian democracy and Indian secularism have run into graver crisis in this period.
Well, as you know, we are in the midst of, also in the United States, all these issues, all these tensions have emerged together with the need for social distance. We had, of course, the demonstrations, the movement for racial justice, and then the counter movements of rallies during the electoral and in the name of the right to protest. And so there has been all kinds of conflictive issues. We are in the midst of the elections. We thought when we were going to have this meeting that feel like we will have already a resolution. There is no resolution yet. But I want to ask you about how this India has been looking at this election. I mean, I remember that when the pandemic was emerging, Trump was actually visiting India, had a triumphal visit to India, a good relationship with Prime Minister Modi. And in fact, it was then that Trump was upset because of the mention of the pandemic had brought down the stock market. So the question is, how do Indian society in general look at American elections? And especially, how has Indian society responded to the possibility that an Indian American and Black American basically could become the first woman vice president of the United States?
Well, I think there are two parts to this question. One, of course, is the relationship between India and the United States of America, and that is now reached a stage of a certain stability. I mean, there is a strategic partnership, both in matters of defense and in trade and on trade, that's been developing for now 20 odd years, or more perhaps. And I think that's not going to change. It's going to be, the basic terms of alliance between these two countries is not going to change with the election of Biden, if Biden and Harris were to become president and vice president. I don't think that's going to change. But Trump has given a massive impetus worldwide to aspiring rulers to enter politics by breaking every established political norm and convention. He's encouraged a complete disregard for law. He's encouraged a cult of personality. He's treated state treasury as his own personal wealth. And if Biden and Harris were to be elected, and if they were to stop all this from happening, it will certainly have some impact on the political culture of America's democratic partners, such as India. I mean, some impact. Their election gives a faint hope to liberals and Democrats in other parts of the world. And just as it would make the American state, at least from my point of view, I've made, a little more sensitive to the plight of Blacks and immigrants. Just so I think it may have some restraining influence, just a wee bit, on the further consolidation of majoritarianism, and it might discourage some blatantly discriminatory practices against minorities. But I really can't say. My personal view is obvious to, I'd really, no matter what happens, it would be wonderful to have this political change. If that were to happen, it would be good I believe, for the entire world. On Kamala Harris, I think there is some enthusiasm, but I think the response is somewhat muted. The warmth in the response is kind of is held back, and I think that has to do with the Modi-Trump friendship, and I don't think people want to really openly pitch for a Democrat because they don't want to be openly critical of the prime minister. So I think there is. Certainly in Tamil Nadu, where Kamala Harris's mother comes from, and you can see it on television. Kamala Harris's uncle is everywhere on Indian television, talking about American elections and so on. And so I think there is some enthusiasm, but I wouldn't say that it's a very its public expression is as kind of robust as it would have been if it was not for this Modi-Trump partnership. But if that were to happen, it would be a great development, a good, very reasonable development, the election of Biden and Harris.
Well, thank you very much. I think that we've already reached the time when we need to pass to the question and answer period from the audience. I've gathered here a few questions. Let me put two together, which are basically critical remarks on your conception of Indian secularism or the extent to which it is still valid. There comes a question from one of our friends, Joseph Prabhu, who writes, given the features of militant Hindu nationalism that you describe, it seems very little is left of secularism as you originally theorized it. Is it useful analytically to preserve the notion of it at all, given that both critical respect and principal distance are greatly undermined? Another version of the same question comes from Jeff. How do you respond to Cecile Laborde's recent critique of your position of principal distance, stating that it lacks critical distance, and so it cannot explain when and why Indian law and policies fall short of secularism? So very broad critiques, but I want to give you a chance to answer whatever you think is relevant from those critiques.
Okay, I think, yeah, thanks a lot for these questions. Well, I think, it's undeniable that that both, I've myself been saying this, that the Indian Constitution is under attack. Indian secularism, as it was spelled out in the Constitution, is also being undermined. And this process of undermining it has been going on for several decades. The BJP is not the only party. It has made full use of this. It's exploited it fully, but the dismantling was done by many political parties, and in fact by misconceptions and misunderstandings among Indian secularists themselves. So my whole work really started because of my interest in secularism started because of that crisis in Indian secularism. But I think it's important to know, what exactly it is, what principles, what standards are there from which or by which we can judge the practice of Indian secularism. I think those standards are to be found in the Constitution. Those standards must not be imported from one or the other European models, no matter how influenced in its early phase Indian secularism might have been by these conceptions. I think it's very important to keep underlining that there were what these standards were and how Indian secular practice has fallen when judged by these standards. The critique of secularism, both by those who oppose it and those who want to see it flourish, both this critique must come from within, from the normative vocabulary which is developed by Indians themselves. And so I think it's very important to keep this alive. And as I said, this model has relevance not only for Indians but also worldwide. So there is no reason not to keep talking about it. And things change, we're going through a very rough patch, but I'm not that pessimistic that we will never get out of this, and we will never be able to renew the importance and relevance of Indian political secularism for our own country. So I think I don't agree with Joseph that this is something that we should now put aside and move on. So that's my response to Joseph. I think the Cecile Laborde's point. Well, I haven't read it very carefully, but I know a little bit about it. I think there's a misunderstanding there. This is a misunderstanding which is shared by a lot of people, that I kind of misdescribe European models and I over idealize the Indian version. I may have been wrong in the details here and there, but by and large, I think the point that I made in this conversation with you, José, and which you accepted, which is the point about that, the point about accommodation of diversity. That point is something which is extremely important, and this is precisely how we need to judge our own secular practice today. That provides a critical standpoint. It is because there is this push for a kind of homogenization, creating a uniform social and political order that sort of unsettles a lot of people like me, so I don't see that I'm what is it? Something. What are the terms that? What was the particular formulation?
Unfortunately, let me see.
I can't find it in my. Well, anyway, something to the effect that I'm not sufficiently distant from what is it, secular practice or. Right. Well, I think I disagree with that. I don't see that I haven't kept a distance. I mean, my whole idea of critical respect and principled distance is premised on certain fundamental moral values, and from the standpoint of which I critique both Indian practice and practices elsewhere. So that I simply think this is a misunderstanding. But the other point, which is there in Cecile Laborde's paper, which is that liberal democracy is sufficient, and that we can dispense with the term secular. And this is the point that is made by a number of people. I think, and it's been made by many Indians as well. I think that misses one crucial issue. I think secularism is not just about not just against discrimination on grounds of religion. It's also about public recognition to groups who define themselves in terms of their religion. I think that's an issue which is there in Europe. I think a lot of what we call multiculturalism was about what Charles has called a politics of recognition. And I think the introduction of minority rights in India and the whole issue between Hindu and Muslims in India has been about public recognition of their distinctive religiosities. I mean, there's a thinning down of religion under our conditions, particularly under nationalism. That I agree with. But nonetheless, even when religion becomes a mere identity marker, it's about recognition, and liberal democracy, because of its very strong commitment to individual rights, doesn't have a place for these kind of rights of recognition. And even if you dispel the vocabulary of rights, there has to be some space given to communities to identify themselves and to define themselves in terms of whatever group identity that they wish to foreground. So, and I think secularism alone, by providing rights to religious minorities and by fighting inter-religious domination, is able to do that. That's why it's important that liberal democracy acknowledges there's a kind of a separate space for a distinctive space for secular politics, which I agree is partly to do, as I said, with non-discrimination, but it's also got to do with this. It also has something to do with this dimension of a recognition. I think the board. I'll probably write to her, and I will respond maybe publicly. But I think this is something which is not acknowledged by her. I hope that satisfies.
And well, yes. On a related issue, there is a question by Tarunjit Butalia on Gandhi's view of secularism. And he writes, Mohandas Gandhi stated at prayer meeting on December 1947, it cannot be said that Sikhism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism are separate religions. All these four faiths and their offshoots are one. Hinduism is an ocean into which all the rivers run. It can absorb Islam and Christianity and all other religions, and only then can it become an ocean. Otherwise, it merely remains a stream along which large ships cannot ply. So the question is, it seems to me that Gandhi was a religious pluralist, but only if the other faiths were a part of the Hindu faith tradition. What are your thoughts on this matter?
Yeah, I think we need to make a distinction between, this word Hindu is very peculiar. In India, it was always used by others to refer to people who lived on the other side of the river Sindhu. Or Indus. This is the Persian rendering of the same word. I mean, Hindu. Or the Greek in whatever Indus. So I think a lot of it, Hindu can be used for a larger cultural imaginary of ancient India, which is not really. This is quite peculiar because as everybody knows, I mean, there is this kind of ethos or this imaginary had continuously reproduced itself in different ways. It has survived many onslaughts, both from within and from outside. And I think this is a kind of a culture in which there is this culture shares a very common semantic universe where all kinds of translations take place. The gods of one culture are believed to be equal to the gods of another culture, and that's what Gandhi kept saying. One of his famous prayers was, Allah tero naam, Ishwar tero naam. Meaning your name is Allah and your name is also Ishwar. I mean, so it's the same, whatever God or entity, which is called by different names. And this is very, very common in the ancient, so-called, I mean, this is a term that we shouldn't, perhaps we should use it. Polytheistic cultures of ancient world, of the ancient world. But not only was there this equivalence that was established by translation, but also gods were hyphenated. Two gods of two very different cultures were brought together, half of this and half of that, or they were related to each other in some kind of kinship. So Ganesh becomes the son of Shiva and so on and so forth. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which, by equivalence, by hyphenation, or by some other invented relationship, you have this very intrinsic world created in which you don't really convert from one to the other, because conversion means leaving one and adopting something else. Whereas here, Gandhi always felt there was no point in conversion. Sometimes he felt that you could be both, you could be many. There is no need to be just one. You could become many. You could have many belongings or many attachments. So I think this is a particular formulation which I, if it was the only formulation of Gandhi, I would disagree with it. But in fact, Gandhi, had, innumerable other contexts in which he spelt out his own version of secularism, which was not of absorption of other religions into Hinduism, but of being able to see that all religions that have come to the subcontinent begin to share this common semantic universe, this kind of the social imaginary, which encourages a very distinct kind of pluralism, and which allows people to be many rather than to be exclusively one. I think that's the spirit in which you should understand Gandhi, not as somebody who's trying to make, to absorb other religions into one, and to accommodate other religions only on condition that they all become Hindus in some large inclusive sense. I think that is more a Savarkarite idea, or an idea that there are Hindu Mohammedans and Hindu Christians and so on. I think Gandhi's idea was very different.
Let's end on this positive note of inclusive pluralism. Unfortunately, we've reached the limit of our time. Thank you, Professor Bhargava, for this fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for attending this conversation. Many questions, unfortunately, had to remain unanswered, but they are there in the question and answer. Professor Bhargava may, if he has the opportunity, answer them. And again, to everybody, a reminder that this conversation has been video recorded and will be on YouTube, available on our website early next week. Thank you so much, and hope to see you on our next episode of a global and religious secular dynamics that we are counting, that will be scheduled on November 19th with Professor Robert Hefner from Boston University. We'll confirm it shortly. In the meantime, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Keep safe, everybody.